You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike. Welcome into the Psych with Mike Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan, and I am here with Mr. Brett Newcomb.
Hello, young man.
Hey, so are your headphones loud? Are you good?
I never know if they're my headphones or me.
Okay.
I've been accused of being loud.
Does it feel loud? It feels loud to me.
Okay, you're in charge of the controls. Do something.
All right. That's a little bit of behind the scenes for people, so enjoy.
The acknowledgement that you have the power?
Yeah. No. The banter about do we need to pop the headphones up or down?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to talk about, I had sent you the articles about the topic for today.
Yeah.
And you had said, oh, is this a shot at you about...
Right.
We had talked about Brides Magazine at one time. Do you want to expand on
a couple
it?
weeks back on one of our podcasts, you had sent me an article from Brides Magazine, and I gave you a lot of crap about the intellectual respectability and seriousness with which one could read Brides Magazine. And so then this week you send me two articles that are deep scholarly treatises on the development of one of Freud's psychological theories, analytical theories. So I just ask you, is that a comeback across the bow? Because I was giving you so much grief about how shallow you were being.
Yeah.
So you sent me something really deep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while you give me tremendous credit for being that thoughtful and introspective, the truth is much more mundane.
I'm more than willing to accept that.
Yeah. So I sent you what are, yes, actually a couple of very dense articles, and obviously I will include these in the show notes for people who want to look at them. But fair warning, they are extremely dense, and I'm not sure anybody would read them for pleasure. But one of the things that I have... Go ahead.
No.
Okay. One of the things that I have been intrigued by over the development of my own psychological education is this idea in the literature about Freud's theories and how those evolved. And at one point early in his career, Freud had used something called the seduction theory in place of the Oedipal theory, and it's just been something that's been fascinated. So what is the Oedipal theory?
Well, first, let's back up
Okay.
and put this in some perspective. When you're in graduate school today to get a degree in counseling as opposed to looking towards a PhD in psychology, so that you can go out and serve a population and provide services with a master's degree and a license. You get survey courses. You don't get deep, intense analytical courses. Mm-hmm. And in terms of counseling, as opposed to psychiatry, the theories of Freud are fundamental, but quickly covered with synopsis of different things. So if you don't personally become curious and do more in-depth reading and research, you're just going to get a brush over. And then they move on to personality theory and development of adolescence and all that kind of stuff to say, if you got somebody coming in your office and they want to sit down and talk to you about something, you don't want to approach it from a classic Freudian analytic perspective. For one thing, insurance companies won't pay for it. Mm-hmm. So you have to have somebody that's independently wealthy. And if you're doing classically approach Freudian analysis, then your client needs to come in 2 or 3 times a week for an hour or 2 at a time and do non-directed free association for years before you start to ever interpret anything. And you as the clinician are supposed to be a blank mirror on which they can project themselves and their issues. So you're not supposed to have any personality. Your office is not supposed to have any personality. You're not supposed to have books you read or pictures of of your children or pictures of your car or anything that can identify you as a living human being. You're supposed to sit behind them, have them lay on the couch so that they can't see you, read your body language, read your facial expression, notice whether or not you're asleep. As a matter of fact, we both have a friend who's a psychologist who sent her adolescent son to a Freudian psychiatrist for a number of years, and her son told me one time in his analysis, he really had a breakthrough moment and was really excited about what he had discovered and felt, and was kind of swept away by the intensity of the emotions, and the therapist had nothing to say. And so he turned around and looked, and the therapist was asleep, which is, I wonder how uncommon that would be. But anyway, so it's not a thing that most people ever have any access to. It's a very niche market to see a Freudian analyst. But the theories of Freud underlie so many of the different approaches for understanding what people present in therapy, at least from a thought perspective. How do I, when somebody comes in, I'm looking for the pattern. What are the patterns in their life that are painful and dysfunctional? What are the patterns that seem to affect their choice making? Do they have the perception that they have the power to make choices? Are they consumed or subsumed by guilt or depression or anxiety? Where does that seem to come from? How can we understand it? And then how can we approach making changes in it so that they can live a life that's less painful, less disrupted, less disturbed, more satisfying, more happy, with better, healthier relationships? So that's the goal. To get them from where they come in, where they say, I'm in pain and I'm in trouble, my life is not working, to where they can leave and say, you know what, I got a handle on this, I'm going to do all right. So when you hear those things, you try to plug them into patterns that you've been trained to look for and see if they make any sense. So one of those is the Oedipal theory, which has to do with conflict, especially in adolescence. And when Freud gave up his seduction theory, in part, he said, okay, I won't talk about that anymore because he was talking about the young infants in development and their trauma and fantasies and dreams and what have you, focused around sexual attraction or energy between the adult and the child, driven by the adult. Although he, at that point, Freud was saying maybe it comes from the child, maybe it comes from the adult, maybe it comes from both. So then he moves into adolescence, and he said you're going to have conflict with adolescence because there's going to be conflict for the attention of the mother as the adolescent comes into puberty and starts to have sexual hormones and drives and awarenesses that blossom. And especially in isolated, more rural, less urban population centers where you may not have access. And again, in those days, you didn't have television, you didn't have movies, you didn't have mass media, you had people. And so it wouldn't have exposure to much. So if you have, as an adolescent male, and you start having those hormone eruptions and you start having fantasies about your sister or your mother, is that deeply psychologically, mentally ill, or is that just normal because it's a stimuli reaction to the only stimuli that you have? And how do you then process that to say, I'm going to make these choices about my sexual behaviors and my sexual identity? So you get into all that, but that's so then you get caught up in the Oedipal theory.
And Oedipus, or the Oedipal theory, is the name comes from a Greek tragedy where a child was born. The father gets told that the child is going to be his undoing. He has the child taken out to a mountain and abandoned. He later comes back not knowing who he is. He kills his father. He marries his mother, and the
Jocasta.
Yeah, the prophecy is therefore fulfilled. So that's where the name comes from. And I've always been just fascinated.
I remember when I was in college, we were reading Oedipus in a British Lit course. And the professor was such a dramatic man and could read beautifully and just would mesmerize us reading these plays and poems and things. And he'd get caught up in it. And he was pacing up and down the room reading the scene from Oedipus where Jocasta, the queen, mounts the wall of the battlement wall where the soldiers are, and she finds this young soldier a couple steps up above her on the battlement, and he's wearing little short skirt thing that they wore back then, and she finds his thighs to be really attractive. So she reaches up and she's stroking his thighs and saying, got nice legs here. And as he reads those lines, he's standing next to me and he reaches down and strokes my thigh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And consciously or unconsciously?
Well, he was caught up in the moment, he said. So, who knows? I just had incredibly attractive thighs.
Well, sure.
I was expecting something like that from somebody.
Well, absolutely.
Spend nights praying that somebody would notice. Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that was probably validating.
Oh, so much so, yeah.
So I've always been absolutely fascinated by Freud's theories and by his development. I think that the biggest reason we probably continue to be educated about Freud at all is that he wasn't the first psychiatrist in the history of the world, but he was the first one to really codify a theory.
Well, but he had several theories. You get the id-ego, superego perspective. You get the conscious-unconscious stuff. You get the sexual identity, sexual energy, and drive theory. So, I mean...
But I don't think
pay your money and buy your ticket. Which one are you going to focus on?
I think that overall, but it was all bundled into a codified theory. So the id, the ego, the superego are parts of the psyche. The psyche is driven by energy that Freud said was coming from the libido, and so it was the sexual drive that motivated people to move through that psychic development. And then later, his daughter Anna and some of the theoreticians that came, again, I don't know if that's a word, but I used it, so it's a word.
It's a word.
Who came later, they moved the driving force from the libidinal energy to the energy of the ego. And I know this is really esoteric for people who don't know what this is, but basically, I think that most people agree with a majority of, or at least could say, that they could operate within a paradigm that is set up by Freud, except for this idea that the focus of the motivation came from the libido. And that's where the seduction theory comes in, because I found this article from The Atlantic that really, for me, kind of turned this upside down.
The article does a really good job of explaining the politics of the time.
Yeah.
And the power struggles at the foundation of psychiatry, where Freud was the progenitor of the theories, and then other adolescent psychiatrists, so to speak, would mature into their own ownership and want to create their own interpretation of that reality, and they get into arguments and power struggles among themselves. Who's going to dominate the field? Who's going to have the definitive say? Who has really understood why mental illness, emotional illness, neuroses, psychosis, whatever, exist? How do we identify it? And so on. And then as time passed, when Anna comes along and is developing in the 40s and 50s, there was World War II and the Nazis and all the stuff that happened with the concentration camps. And so then some of that had to be more, and they were Jewish, and so some of that had to be more socially constrained in its presentation. And I think this Atlantic article talks to that a lot. How do you learn to say things that are politically acceptable enough that you don't get burned at the stake, but still offer something provocative or evocative to think about?
Right.
So,
and I absolutely agree with that the article does a really good job of talking about those different constraints that were being put on Freud to move him towards a more socially acceptable definition of these theories. But let's take our break, and then when we come back, we're going to unpack what actually the article does that kind of blew my mind. You know, if you've gotten this far into the show, then obviously you find the show to be worthwhile, beneficial, maybe even helpful. And so I just wanted to say, if you've gotten this far into the show and you want to help us out, even if you don't want to help us out, just do it anyway. Go to Apple Podcasts and rate us and leave a review. That is super helpful. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and hit the bell icon so that you get get notifications when new shows drop. That stuff is really, really helpful for us. And I know that Mr. Brett agrees.
Absolutely. Reviews are positive. Positive reviews are more positive, but negative ones are as well, because it helps you decide how to focus and how whatever you're intending to say is being heard.
And the secret is the algorithm doesn't care whether the review's positive or negative.
As our friend Mike Norton says regularly, feedback is a gift.
If it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike. Okay, we're back. And so for me, the very first time, and as I told you before, I never heard boo about the seduction theory in undergrad. And it wasn't specifically taught in graduate school, although by that time I was more interested in Freud as a theoretician, because I myself was, while I was very, very CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, coming out of graduate school, I was fascinated by psychoanalytic theory and doing some of my own independent research. That was the first time that I ever actually even heard about the seduction theory. And what I read was that the difference between the Oedipal theory, which is in adolescence, as you adroitly pointed out, the seduction theory was about infants and about the fact that infants had these sexual cravings and desires, and that some of their infantile, I'm cute, play with me behavior was motivated by those desires, whether they're conscious or unconscious. And that seemed pretty provocative to me, and I can understand why people wouldn't want to hear that. But in this article, the author, who is intimately involved in the very inner circle of psychoanalytic theory and history, really lays the foundation for what Freud was talking about, was that people were coming to his office and they were expressing neuroses, and the neuroses was being caused by trauma that they had experienced in childhood because they had been attacked, abused, or otherwise mistreated sexually.
So there is a resistance in Western society to accepting the reality that adult post-adolescent males are sexually attracted to or aroused by children and infants, and sometimes indulge themselves in those behaviors. We don't have any accurate roadmap that says 14% of the population is susceptible to this, 53% of the population are victims of this, anything like that. We just get these bursts of awareness when some case makes the news and somebody argues that presentation, or as a therapist you get it when somebody comes in and they say, and one of the initial questions clinically that you ask a new client, do you have sexual trauma history? 90% of the time they'll say no, they don't.
You and I are even more intimately associated with this, because you and I, while we didn't work directly for the Archdiocese, we worked as consultants for the Archdiocese, and we were integral in developing and presenting the response to the priest crisis here in St. Louis.
The Protecting God's Children program? Yeah.
And we saw directly the reaction that we got when we went out into the community to try and train people to be aware of some of the
grooming
potential
behavior.
Yeah. And people would just become irate. Well, you're saying I'm a bad coach, or you're saying that I can't take the kids camping. No, we're not saying those things. We're trying to present a prescribed menu of behaviors that are safe and unsafe, so that kids can be protected, and we're not accusing anybody.
And adults can be protected. I mean, we're talking to coaches and the teachers and staff saying, don't put yourself in a position where you can be exposed to the criticism or the attack, supposition. If you're the coach and you stay and all the other kids leave after practice and you're staying with one kid by yourself, and then later that kid or his parent says, oh, well, wait, something untoward happened here, you have no defense. So position yourself so you have a defense. So you teach specific skills for that. This is how you do it. This is the way you manage it. But yeah, people are offended at the possibility that I've always done that, well, you need to stop.
And if people are that defensive about it today, imagine how defensive about it they would have been in the 1890s before there even was an admission of pedophilism.
Some of that, especially in a Christian community, goes back to the parental ownership theory of childbearing. I own my child, and I can discipline. It's my responsibility to teach them and educate them and support them and discipline them so that they grow in the direction I want them to. The community, the state, needs to just stay out of it. Spare the rod, spoil the child. If the Bible tells me it's okay to beat my child, who are you, city councilman, to tell me that, or school teacher, tell me that I can't do it? And as a school teacher, I can tell you that any number of times that teachers in my teaching community became suspicious that a child might be being sexually abused. Those children who are sexually abused are trained and taught by their parents. These are the questions that can be asked. This is what can be done. This is where you shut up. This is what you say. This is what you don't say. So that if you become suspicious and you say, well, let's talk. Kid goes home and tells his parents. The parents may call the school or the school board and criticize and attack, or they may just pull the kid out and homeschool because you can homeschool them in our state, in our country.
Right.
Which isn't to say that all or most kids who are homeschooled are being abused. It's to say that some of them are.
Some of them are.
And that the laws protect the system.
And we can absolutely definitively say some of them are.
Absolutely. I served on the state child abuse and neglect board and got case after case after case of exactly that happening. So, yeah, it happens. The question is how pervasive, how preponderant, which brings you back to the Freudian theory stuff. How real is this in the average person's life? How many people out there have sexual trauma histories? And what I started to say is, as a clinician, you ask a new client, do you have sexual trauma history? 90+% of them are going to say, oh, no, I don't. Now, that may be because they do and they know it, but they don't trust you yet to talk about it.
Right.
And it may be because they don't know.
Right.
They've suppressed the awareness. And in the process of therapy, as their defenses become stronger and they can face darker and darker memories and experiences, those things will surface. Then as a clinician, you have to be really careful in your training and in your documentation so that you're not accused of the false memory syndrome. Help them create this false memory that never really happened, but they think might have happened. Or they don't remember accurately, and they think it was Grandpa, but it was really Uncle Joey. So you got to be real careful with that and approach it clinically.
Right, because I don't hold the client responsible for getting that accusation wrong, but I do understand that if they do, there's potential harm that could be done to the individual who is falsely accused.
Well, and you have to remember as a clinician, you're not an agent of the state.
Right.
You don't have police authority. Your job's not to bring somebody to justice. Your job is to help that individual who's wounded and hurt get strong, survive, and move on with their lives, whatever that involves. And sometimes they will want to aggressively challenge their abuser, and that can be done, but clinically you need to discuss with them, so what if this doesn't work? What's your reason for doing this? What are you hoping to get out of it? You think Grandpa's going to break down crying and say, oh my God, I abused you, I'm so sorry, I destroyed you? Or is he going to say, as typically these people do categorically, you seduced me. You brought this about. You caused me. You took a moment advantage of my weakness, and we crossed lines, but we crossed them because of you. So the guilt belongs to you.
Right.
And you're going to destroy the family.
Right.
If you bring this up, if you say this out loud, the whole family will just implode.
Right.
Do you want that responsibility? You want to carry that? I mean, it wasn't a big deal. It was just sex. I just touched you.
Right.
Or you touched me. So the confusion and the pain and the distress of that, it's such a delicate conversation.
Most of the time, the person being abused has some kind of connection, usually a loving connection, with the abuser, and so they then start to associate that sense of love with these actions, and they can't then draw the distinction.
Yeah.
And that's a really dangerous place for them to be in. But here's the $25,000 question. This is really kind of, when I was reading this stuff, this is what just kept percolating through my unconscious. And that is, what do you think would have happened if Freud had not met such resistance? If Freud had been able to start to talk about pedophilia in the late 1800s and made it a topic that became that was driven into the zeitgeist of our Western civilization, how do you think things would be different? Do you think things would be different?
No.
Yeah.
I think NAMBLA would have been created
sooner,
40 years sooner.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that's about it. Because we have, just since the pre-scandal and the Boy Scout scandal, I mean, that doesn't mean that these things don't happen in other organizations. It just means that those are the ones that have been most in the news. Because you and I know that 72 to 85% of all physical abuse, sexual abuse, is being committed by someone that not only does the child know, but is usually a member of their immediate family. It's really, really rare that a child is abused by a complete stranger.
Right.
That almost never happens. So these people are well-known individuals, both to the child and to the community. And if it's still happening after we've had those kinds of incidents in a society that has the distribution of information that we have today, then in the 1890s, it probably wouldn't have changed things. But what it means is this has been going on since humans started walking upright.
Right. And it happens in every socioeconomic group. It's not how rich you are, how educated you are, how poor and sleazy you are. It happens across the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. And, the Jeffrey Epstein thing that we've now been exposed to is another example of that. And so I'm just absolutely fascinated by what I have now learned about the development of Freud's theories, and I will continue to research this. And I agree with you. I don't know that would have changed anything, but I certainly would like, when I play in my head, the alternate reality game. And I think about, what if Freud had been able to present these theories and they had been accepted, and people started to accept them as factually accurate, that if you abuse a child sexually, that causes trauma that's going to haunt them potentially for the rest of their lives. If we had started to actually make that a part of what we understood of psychology in the 1890s, I just think psychology would be a very different profession today.
Also, historically, cultural values change, and economic necessity sometimes drives the bus. On the American frontier, when homes and villages were so far apart, and it might not be safe to go and visit your girlfriend's family and spend the day with them when you were dating or sparking her, and then be able to come back home to your home, because the Indians were around and it was dark and there weren't lighted streets and walking through the woods and what have you. So they'd stay over. And then they developed a custom called bundling, where they would, the family of the girl would tie you both together wrapped in blankets, and you'd sleep connected to each other in the same bed under the promise not to expose or explore more than you should. Sometimes they put a board in the middle of the bed to keep them separate on other sides, with the illusion that people can't get over or under the board. Sometimes a sword or a knife. I mean, there were different ways that they separated it out. But the reality was, that's how you meet people, that's how you date people, that's what, in that community in those days. Today, what an outrage.
So it just would be different.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know if that just gushing of unconscious free association on my part was helpful.
It's very revelatory. It always is.
But it is something that I am absolutely fascinated with, that I want to continue to explore and investigate. But as we have been telling you guys, please find us on Facebook at Psych with Mike. Find us on YouTube at Psych with Mike, or search Psych with Mike on YouTube. But specifically on YouTube and iTunes, go to those places and subscribe to the show and leave us a review, because that is so beneficial for us and we would really, really appreciate it. The music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin Declue. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.